criticize Searle's account of institutional reality, I'll take for granted that you're all familiar with the basics of his theory, and I will just start with two objections that I made earlier in several papers. And then I will try to explain what I see now as a crucial problem for this kind of criticism and how it could be eventually solved. The essence of the first objection to Searle's theory is that it applies to a rather limited area of social interaction, represented by games of coordination. Here I use language of game theory, and fails to provide global explanation of social cooperation, which evolutionary game theory is better positioned to offer. And the point of this first objection is that Searle's theory works well when we apply it to the games of pure coordination, but when we try to apply it to games with mixed motives, that are most of the social dilemmas are of that kind. For example, the most famous is Prisoner's Dilemma. That theory simply doesn't work. So the first objection would be that in that respect, evolutionary game theory might do better because it could explain cooperation even in these situations of prisoner's dilemma. The second objection is that conception of collective intentionality does not suffice to explain in what way fairness can be the first virtue of institutions. So the other problem is normative, that in Searle's theory we cannot find conceptual resources to address the problem of justice. And in that respect, I argue that, for example, Rawls' theory of justice as fairness has much better resources to address that question. Taking into account that Searle describes his position as naturalistic, the main task of this presentation will be to examine to what extent the alternative theory, also naturalistic in its character, can address certain problems which remain insolvable in the framework of Searle's theory. One could perhaps notice that there are two basic objections pulled in opposite directions. While the first objection implies a naturalistic framework of evolutionary game theory, the second objection concerns the problems Searle's theory encounters in introducing the conception of justice, which is more normative in nature. The question is whether these two directions of our criticism could be subsumed under a single theoretical framework that would offer an important theoretical alternative to Searle's understanding of institutional reality, which is based on assumption of collective intentionality. Good prospects for such a theoretical framework are provided by recent discussions within evolutionary game theory, which aim to naturalize theory of justice. In distinction to Rawls, who asked which principles of justice could be expected to make a basis of the social contract adopted in conditions which are fair, and which imply moral autonomy, equality, and rationality of individuals, recent research is primarily concerned with the question how evolution of cooperation on the basis of just social contract could have emerged. Some theorists claim that evolution of cooperation is based precisely on stabilizing norms of fairness which are equivalent to the basic principles of justice, for which Rawls assumes that they could be accepted in a hypothetical situation which is fair. The aspiration towards naturalization of the theory of justice is mostly limited to this essential part of Rawls' theory. Rawls held that the main subject of the principles of justice is the basic structure of society, by which he means the system of social institutions. He described the basic idea of justice as fairness as an attempt to arrive at the principles which free and rational individuals would accept in the original position of equality in order to ensure fairness of institutions. This contract comes before all other social contracts, and it is supposed to regulate them precisely because it specifies basic forms of social cooperation. The principles of justice around which an agreement has been made should then be applied to basic institutions of society. Rawls wraps up all these elements with the claim that the guiding idea is that the principles of justice for the basic structure of society are the object of the original agreement. Recent research into the nature of institutions and institutional reality based on rational choice theory, apart from formal rules on which the basic structure of society is based, also places an emphasis on informal rules or social norms. Douglas North thus says that institutions consist of formal written rules as well as typical unwritten codes of conduct that underlie and supplement formal rules, such as not deliberately injuring a key player on the opposing team. And as this analogy would imply, the rules and informal codes are sometimes violated and punishment is enacted. Therefore, an essential part of the functioning of institutions, this is what is important, the functioning of institutions is the costliness of asserting violations and the severity of punishment. The evolutionary game theory has offered an explanation in what way evolution of social norms takes place, but also in what sense rules which are informal in character can guarantee stability and successful functioning of formal rules. The answers which this theory has offered are based on reciprocal altruism and repetition of interactions. The defection strategy in Prisoner's Dilemma game is dominant only in case the game is not repeated. In the case the game is repeated, the player who chooses the defection strategy can predict that her defection in the first round will be punished by defection of other people in the second round. The perspective then somewhat changes. It turns out that for each player, the much more profitable strategy now is to cooperate in the first round and then act in accordance with actions of other people. That is a famous tit-for-tat strategy from Axelrod's evolution of cooperation. The evolution of norms takes place precisely due to the large number of interactions which have proved to be successful, while their maintenance rests on a aforementioned mechanism of punishing those who defect. Binmer says that if the prisoner's dilemma is repeated, the default theorem would mandate that it is possible to maintain cooperation as a self-policing social contract. Unlike Rawls, who presupposes a hypothetical condition of the original position in which people behind the veil of ignorance choose the first principles of justice, Binmer perceives social contract as a set of common understandings which enable individuals who make up society to achieve successful coordination to pursue their aspirations. Regardless of impositions made by formal rules and laws, social contract is made up of those rules and norms to which people adhere in everyday life in order to coordinate their activities. Laws which sanction certain behavior are relevant only to the extent to which they are obeyed. The social contract is self-regulating because its stability rests on previously described mechanism of punishment. Even though punishment for breaching norms can be very rigorous, most of the time it is very subtle and barely noticeable, so that people most time adjust their behavior in such a way to make it conform to what is considered an accepted social contract unconsciously. We have seen in what way evolutionary game theory contributes to explanation of evolution of norms of cooperation. However, the proposed solution does not rule out the problem of indeterminacy. Namely, on the basis of what we are to assume that an optimal rather than suboptimal equilibrium would be chosen within society. According to Binmer, even though the answer to this problem is mostly sought in culture, it should be noted that human biology must impose constraints on what social contracts can evolve, just as human biology imposes constraints on the deep structure of languages that can evolve. Therefore, the deep structure of social contracts should be sought in biology because this structure is actually, this is said by Binmer's words, because they are actually written in our genes. This by no means implies a sort of genetic determinism which rules out any influence of culture. If reference to biology can explain the deep structure of social contracts, reference to culture actually explains multitude of variants of social contracts in different time periods or in different societies. The previous explanation of norms and the point the deep structure of social contract is written in our genes still does not guarantee that norms and contracts themselves would be just. In other words, previous assumptions and explanations in the light of these assumptions would constitute only a part of the story. In what way can the norm of fairness evolve? Binmer thinks that fairness can be perceived precisely as a solution offered by evolution to the problem of choice of an equilibrium which emerges in games which have a multitude of possible equilibria. The main reason for the evolution of norms of fairness is precisely that they allowed our species a quick and efficient way to solve the coordination problems that inevitably arise when a group is faced with a new situation. For example, how should a novel source of food be shared without fighting or wasteful conflict? Fairness has been seen as an evolutionary solution to the equilibrium selection problem that arises in certain games with multiple equilibria. Earlier, it has been stressed that Binmer considers social contracts dependent on both cultural and genetic factors. This is also true for the social contract of fairness. It cannot be claimed that the norms of fairness are fully genetically determined because it is possible to observe significant variations regarding what is considered fair in various societies and even within one society in various time periods and its various parts. But it does not mean that it is sufficient to refer merely to culture for the explanation of the norms of fairness. If Binmer earlier claimed the deep structure of social contract is written in our genes is right, it means that the deep structure which implies fairness also has to be written in our genes. According to him, it is precisely Rawls' conception of justice and fairness which has crucial importance for an explanation of what it does deep structure of fairness look like. He claims that the deep structure of fairness is encompassed by Rawls' conception of the original position. Insisting only on the self-interest turned out to be a bad strategy when individuals decide in this hypothetical situation, because due to the veil of ignorance, no person can be sure that insisting on self-interest she will not end up in an extremely unfavorable position of the least advantaged person in this future society. Binmer therefore concludes that the outcome of negotiations in the original position will be egalitarian, but not quite in the sense that Rawls has in mind. Speaking on this result, Brian Skirms says that in a repeating setting in which the option to renegotiate the contract behind the veil is always freely available, the only viable position is egalitarian. Otherwise, those who get the short end of the stick would always opt to renegotiate. According to Binmer, this egalitarian outcome would reflect Aristotle's position that the just is what is proportionate, although the road leading to it would pass through the theory of negotiations. The importance of the conclusions regarding proportionality of outcomes for a naturalistic theory of justice will not be further explored on the basis of negotiations as Binmer does. Instead, we will rely on the ultimatum game experiments. In this game, two players have a possibility to share a certain amount of money. Player 1 proposes to player 2 a certain distribution. If player 2 accepts the proposed distribution, the sum of money will be apportioned in that way. However, player 2 also has a possibility to reject the proposed manner of distribution. In this case, both players are left with nothing. In numerous experiments with the ultimatum game, it has been demonstrated that the more distant the offer by player 1 from the egalitarian distribution of 50-50%, the more the readiness of player 2 to reject the offer increases, and vice versa. These experiments show that persons are ready to reject an unfair offer despite the fact that they are thus acting to their own detriment, because any distribution which includes an amount greater than 0 for player 2 is better than an outcome of the game when the offer is rejected. Even though this experiment furnish evidence which supports the naturalistic theory of justice, they in a sense question the assumption of individual rationality on which the theory is based. Sanford and colleagues have tested the hypothesis that in addition to activating cognitive processes, decision-making in the ultimatum game involve emotional processes as well. They scan players who have been in position to accept or reject an offer, this is player 2 in our presentation of the ultimatum game, with functional magnetic resonance imaging, to ascertain which neurological substrata have been activated when accepting or rejecting various offers. Their research has shown that in addition to activating the area of dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, or DLPFC, mostly in charge of higher cognitive functions, bilateral anterior insula is also activated, which mostly signals negative emotions such as pain, feeling of hunger, thirst, as well as anger and disgust. The activation of these areas is conversely proportionate to cases of accepting or rejecting, because unfair offers that are substantially rejected have greater interior insula than DLF-PFC activation, whereas accepted offers exhibit greater DLPFC than interior insula. Even though it may seem that results of research by Stanford and colleagues question the assumption of rationality, it can also be concluded that emotions also play a significant role for the analysis of norms of fairness in addition to rationality. In that sense, there are good reasons to expand discussion based on rational choice theory in the direction of considering the role of emotions in decision making. And for example, Jon Elster is famous for this expanding theory of rational choice towards considering the role of emotions. So, previous discussion could be summed up as follows. In contrast to Searle's explanation of institutional reality, based on formal rules, which he terms constitutive rules, and on collective intentionality, evolutionary game theory offers explanations which are based on informal rules or social norms and individual rationality. Even though Searle describes his position as naturalistic, he has failed to consider implications of an alternative position based on evolutionary game theory. In this paper, we have attempted to show that evolutionary game theory offers a much better framework for naturalistic understanding of institutional reality. Its additional advantage is that its framework enables us to explain emergence and maintenance of norms of fairness, for which elements of constitutive rules and collective intentionality are not sufficient. In that sense, a theory of institutions and theory of justice based on evolutionary game theory have some advantages over Searle's conception, at least to the degree to which one wishes to consistently abide by a naturalistic point of view.